Tonight we're starting with something a little different. Not a battle, not a throne room, not the rise or fall of anything dramatic. Tonight we're starting with a small piece of clay. Something you could hold in one hand without much effort. Something worn at the edges, a little uneven in weight, and covered in pressed marks that most people would walk past without a second thought. It should have crumbled. Clay does that. Left to time and moisture, and the ordinary weight of centuries, it dissolves back into the ground it came from. But it didn't. This particular kind of object. And there are thousands of them now, resting in museum drawers and glass cases from London to Baghdad. Survived because it was baked. Accidentally in most cases. A fire moved through the room, through a building, through a city, and the clay that was meant to be temporary became permanent instead. The records that no one thought to save were saved anyway, by the very disasters that destroyed everything around them. Before we go any further, if you're settling in for the night, this is a good moment to get comfortable. Pull whatever you need a little closer. You don't have to do anything tonight except rest. If this kind of quiet history finds you well, feel free to leave a like on the video. It genuinely helps this channel stay going. And if you'd like more nights like this one, the subscribe button is right there. We'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Drop it in the comments when you wake up or before you drift off. Whichever comes first. Now, let's begin. The room where you'd encounter one of these tablets today is usually quiet. Cool in the way that old stone buildings stay cool even in summer. The lighting tends to be low and directed. The kind of light that falls across a surface without flooding it. You'd stand at a glass case, maybe lean slightly forward, and there it would be. Palm-sized, buff-coloured, or a pale grey, depending on the clay and what the heat did to it. You might notice the weight of it before anything else, even through the glass. It looks dense, like something that means business, even if you can't yet read what it says. The surface isn't flat exactly. There's a slight curve to it, the natural result of a thumb pressing clay into shape before the signs were made. The edges are worn down in places, rubbed smooth over a long journey through time that involved burial, excavation, handling by archaeologists, conservation labs, and eventually the still air of a display case. And in the face of all that, the marks remain. Pressed triangles, wedge shapes, small impressions arranged in patterns that are just orderly enough to tell you. Someone was keeping track of something. That's what these earliest tablets are, at their most direct. Records, accounts. The quiet administrative backbone of a world that was already more organised than it had any right to be. The place most associated with their origin is a city in what's now southern Iraq. The site goes by the name Uruk today, though it has carried other names across other languages and other centuries. In the late 4th millennium, which is a range of years somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 years ago, give or take, it was one of the largest settlements anywhere on Earth. Large enough that the word city doesn't feel like an overstatement. Large enough that its influence, in the form of materials and practices and ways of organising things, moved outward into the surrounding landscape for hundreds of miles in every direction. At its centre, or near enough, was a complex of buildings and open spaces that archaeologists describe using the name Iana. Scholars place it in the category of sacred precincts. An interpretation based on physical evidence, the scale of the architecture, and comparisons with later sites and texts. What it felt like to be inside it, what governed it, what ordinary rhythms passed through its courtyards each morning. Those things are harder to say with confidence. The written record from this period is still in its earliest form, and it speaks mostly in quantities and categories. Not in feelings or names. That's one of the things that makes this period quietly unusual. The tablets that survive from it are not stories. They are not prayers, or royal announcements, or records of wars. They are lists, rations of grain and barley, quantities of fish, numbers of animals moving through a counting point. At first encounter they can seem dry, even disappointing. You go looking for the beginning of writing and you find an invoice. But sit with that for a moment and it becomes something else entirely. Someone needed to count. Someone needed the count to survive beyond a single conversation. And someone found a way to press that need into a surface that would outlast them by 55 centuries. The signs themselves in this earlier stage are not yet the wedge-shaped script most people have heard called cuneiform. There's something earlier, more pictographic in feeling, though already moving away from pure pictures towards something more abstract and systematic. A sign for a head, a sign for a bowl, signs that represent categories of things, combinations of ideas compressed into a small space. They were meant to be read by someone who already knew the system, not by a stranger, not by posterity. The person pressing these signs into clay wasn't writing for us. They were finishing their shift. And that quietly is what makes the object feel so strange and so close at the same time. It is not a monument. It is not a declaration. It is a to-do list from the end of a working day in a city that no longer exists, preserved by fire, moved across centuries by pure accident, and now resting under careful light while you breathe slowly in the dark. And for a while that's enough to hold the object, the surface, the marks that stayed when everything else dissolved. The thing is, a tablet like this one doesn't exist alone. It never did. Behind it, around it, preceding it, were storehouses full of similar tablets. Scribes who trained for years to make these marks correctly. Administrators who received reports and issued quantities in return. Canals that moved grain from one part of the city to another. And somewhere in all of that, not yet clearly visible in the record, not yet speaking in the first person, was whatever held the whole system together. That's what the tablet points toward, if you follow its edges outward instead of inward. Not just one account of barley or fish or animals, but a city behind the account, a landscape behind the city. And a question, I'm still open after all this time, about what kind of organisation could have made all of this possible before the names we expect to find were clearly written down anywhere. The clay tablet in its case says nothing about that directly. It keeps its own counsel, the way very old things tend to do. But the storehouses were real, the canals were real, the city was real, and somewhere in the distance, past the cool quiet of the museum room, and back across a very long stretch of time, all of it was moving, quietly, steadily, without announcement. The storehouses were real. That's worth sitting with for a moment before anything else. Not as an abstraction, not as a word in a textbook, but as actual buildings, with actual walls standing on actual ground beside actual water. Mud brick walls most likely. Thick ones because mud brick needs thickness to do its job. Wide enough to keep grain cool through the heat of a southern Mesopotamian summer. Wide enough to keep moisture out when the river rose. Wide enough to last. At least for a season, at least for a generation. Long enough for the people inside to feel that something solid had been built. If you let your attention drift out from the museum case and the tablet inside it, and follow the question of where that tablet came from, really came from, not just which dig site, but which kind of world, you start to arrive somewhere flat and wide and very old. The landscape of lower Mesopotamia in those centuries was not the landscape it is today. Picture something slower, more open. The rivers that ran through it, the Euphrates most of all, did not stay fixed in their courses the way rivers in other places tend to do. They wandered. Over decades and centuries, they shifted across the plain, depositing silt, cutting new channels, filling old ones with mud and eventually with reeds. The land that was dry one generation could be under a shallow flood the next, and the land that flooded one year could be drained and planted the year after that. If someone had dug the right channel in the right place at the right time, that's what the canals were. Not decoration, not engineering for its own sake. and they were the basic condition of survival in a landscape that had no natural stability. Dig a channel from the river to a field, and you could grow things. Let the channel silt up and go unrepaired, and the field went dry. The canal wasn't just useful, it was the difference between a settlement that lasted and one that didn't. Uruk sat within this kind of environment, close enough to the Euphrates to draw from it, connected to smaller waterways and marsh edges, and the wide reed beds that stretched across the lower plain. It was a wet world in many places. The smell of it would have been water and mud and growing things. Thick, living air, warm and slightly heavy. Herons over shallow water. The sound of slow current moving through cut channels. Reed beds dense enough to disappear into, and then rising above all of that flatness, and at what must have felt like an improbable height, the top edge of a mudbrick terrace against a pale morning sky. That terrace was part of what scholars now describe as the Iana precinct, a district within Uruk that carried some of the largest and most complex architecture found anywhere in the ancient world at that time. These were not small buildings. The platforms and structures associated with this area were built on a scale that required planned labour, organised materials, and sustained effort over long periods. Scholars interpret them as serving both sacred and administrative functions, with the two roles so closely linked in this period that separating them cleanly is probably the wrong approach. What the buildings look like at their fullest is still being pieced together from excavation, but some details are unusually clear, and cone mosaics appear on certain walls. Thousands of small clay cones pressed into plaster surfaces, their flat ends painted in red, black and white to form geometric patterns. It sounds like decoration, and it was that too, but it was also signal. This kind of surface required materials, time and organised effort to produce. The building wearing it was not a modest structure. It was meant to be seen and understood as something different from the mud brick houses and workshops around it. The courtyards were large, open air presumably, the kind of space where many people could move without crowding, where deliveries could arrive and be checked and redirected, where the ordinary business of a very large institution, receiving, measuring, recording, or distributing, could happen in the open light of morning before the day grew too warm to work comfortably outdoors. Over time, life inside Uruk settled into rhythms that the landscape itself had shaped. The agricultural cycle organised everything else, planting after the flood season receded, harvest before the next rise, the gap between, the dry months filled with maintenance, canal clearing, wall repair, basket weaving, and the slow work of preparing for the next turn of the year. Animals moved through the city in numbers, sheep and goats mostly. Their wool, their milk, their meat, and eventually their hides all passed through systems of collection and redistribution that left traces in the tablets we find later. And even the fish from the marshes and river edges seem to have moved through organised channels before they reached individual households. This is the part of the Uruk story that tends to get overlooked in favour of firsts. The first city, the first writing, the first this and the first that. What actually filled the days was much quieter than any list of firsts suggests. It was the sound of a heavy wooden door being dragged open at dawn, the weight of a reed basket full of grain against someone's back, the particular thud of a sealed clay jar being set down on a stone floor, the smell of bread baking near a courtyard wall while the morning air was still cool enough to make it pleasant. The city did not feel like a marvel to the people inside it. It felt like Tuesday. It felt like the place they lived, met with all the ordinary fatigue and repetition that entails. And yet the scale of it was remarkable even so. By around 3200 BCE, Uruk is estimated to have held tens of thousands of people within and around its boundaries. A population that would have been, at that moment, almost without parallel anywhere on Earth. The walls that surrounded it were long, The institutions within it were large enough that they functioned more like what we might now recognise as organisations than like households or extended families. The city had reached a size where the old methods of keeping track, memory, word of mouth, the trust of a small community where everyone knew everyone, were no longer quite enough. That's the thing about scale. It changes what works. A village can run on memory. A city cannot. And so the same hands that shape mudbrick into walls, that cut channels through soft alluvial earth, that press cone after cone into wet plaster on a building meant to last, those same hands, or hands trained in the same institutions, eventually picked up a reed stylus, pressed it against a palm-sized surface, and began to mark what needed to be remembered. Not to write literature, not to make history. Just to keep track of what was moving, what was stored, what was owed, what had arrived, and what still needed to come. The tablets in the museum case had to start somewhere, and it started here, in a city already too large to hold in a single person's head, sitting beside a river that never quite held still, inside walls that the plain itself seemed to have grown rather than built. The reed came from the marshes. That's where it started, at least in the most physical sense. Someone cut a length of it, trimmed one end to a point or a bevel, and pressed that end into soft clay. The angle of the press, the depth, the rotation of the wrist, all of that determined what mark appeared. A narrow wedge, a broad one, a circle made by the rounded end of the stylus rather than the tip. Each mark meant something specific to the person reading it, in the same way that a tally mark on a wall means something to the person who made it, even if it means nothing to a stranger passing by centuries later. What's easy to forget is that this was not a dramatic moment in the room where it happened. There was no ceremony around it. No one stood back and felt the weight of what had just been invented. A person sat on a low stool, or cross-legged on the floor against the wall of a storeroom, and made marks on a surface because something needed to be recorded before the day ended and the memory faded. That was all it was. An ordinary act repeated over and over in many different hands across many seasons. The clay itself was local. Alluvial clay, the same material the walls were built from, the same material the bricks were dried from. It was available in quantities that were, for practical purposes, unlimited. You shaped a small amount of it into a rough tablet. Not a perfect rectangle, not a carefully measured form, but a palm-sized lump pressed into a workable flatness. And then you had a surface. The surface was soft enough to take an impression and firm enough to hold it while you worked. Once finished, the tablet could be left to dry in the air, or stored wet, or fired if someone wanted it to last past the immediate need. Most of them were not fired deliberately. The ones that survived did so because something else burned them for free. The marks pressed into these surfaces in the earliest phase are what scholars describe as proto-cuneiform, not yet the fully developed wedge-shaped system that would come later. Earlier than that, and slightly different in character, more pictographic in origin, but already moving toward abstraction, in ways that show the system had been developing and standardising across the community of people who used it. A sign that began as a picture of a head had, by the time it appears on most surviving tablets, become a simplified impression that no longer looks much like a head at all. The picture had been worn smooth by repetition, and the way a word changes slightly each time a different mouth says it. What did these tablets record? The answers are specific enough to be almost surprising in their plainness. Grain, barley, malt, beer, bread, fish, sheep, goats, cattle, textiles, in categories that distinguish between different weights and grades of cloth. Labour, measured in units that appear to reflect days of work or ration equivalents. Rations distributed to named categories of workers, not named individuals but named roles. The designations used correspond to what scholars translate as things like dependent workers, craftspeople, or members of various institutional households. The records in this phase are, above all, quantity records. Numbers matter as much as the signs themselves. The numeral system used in these tablets was not a simple tally. It was already a structured system, with different symbols representing different quantities depending on what was being counted. Grain was counted differently from animals. Discrete objects were counted differently from measured volumes. The system had an internal logic that required training to use correctly, which is itself evidence that the people making these tablets had been taught, not just improvised their way to the same result. Meanwhile, these tablets were being made in large numbers. This is not one person's private accounting habit. Archives found at Uruk and at other sites from the same broad period contain hundreds and eventually thousands of tablets. They cluster in what excavators interpret as storage areas, rooms or sections of larger buildings where records were kept together, organised in ways that suggest someone expected to retrieve them later. Whether retrieval was common or practical is one of those things the record doesn't fully answer. But the tablets were kept. They were not discarded immediately after use. That decision to keep them rather than destroy them is itself a kind of statement about what the institution valued. Some of these tablets are now in museums with very long histories of their own. Objects that passed through the antiquities trade in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, before modern excavation standards, ended up in collections in Paris, London, Berlin, New York. The Met holds examples, the Louvre holds examples, the British Museum holds examples. They sit in cases now, small and pale and slightly rough to the eye, and the visitor who stops to look at them sees what appears to be an irregular surface, covered in small angular marks that don't obviously resolve into meaning. Which is accurate. They don't resolve into meaning unless you've spent years learning how to read them. What's easy to forget is that the person who made each one faced no such difficulty. The signs were second nature. The numerals were familiar. The commodity categories were part of a shared institutional vocabulary that everyone working in that context understood without thinking about it. The way a person today reads a price tag without pausing to decode what a number means. Over time, the system spread, not just within Uruk, but outward. Her sites across a wide region of the ancient Near East have produced tablets and administrative materials that show contact with or adoption of Uruk-style accounting practices. Distant places that are now in Syria and Iran and southeastern Turkey, produced objects that fit the same general administrative pattern. Whether this spread came from direct population movement, from trade, from the influence of a large institution, or from some combination of all three, is still a subject of genuine scholarly debate. The tablets don't explain themselves on that point. What they do preserve, and this is the part that carries a quiet weight, is the shape of an economy, not its drama, not its politics, not the names of the people who ran it, just the shape, the categories of goods that mattered, the labour structures that moved them, the counting systems that tracked them, the physical routines of people whose days were organised around receiving, measuring, recording, and distributing things in quantities that had to be right. A tablet recording 300 units of barley, issued to a category of workers, tells you something real about the institution it came from. It tells you the institution was large enough to need that kind of record. It tells you someone's job was to make the record. It tells you someone else's job was to check it. And it tells you that the barley existed, was moved, was counted, and was considered worth tracking. But the tablet does not tell you the name of the person who pressed those marks. It does not tell you how they felt about the work. More, it does not tell you whether they went home tired or whether they had a home in the sense we'd recognise. It does not tell you who gave them the authority to make the record official, or what happened if the count turned out to be wrong. The tablets speak in categories and quantities, and institutional roles. The people behind them remain, for now, just out of reach, present in every mark, invisible in every line. The people behind the tablets were not ghosts. That's worth saying plainly. They were real people who came to work in the morning and left in the evening, or didn't leave, who ate food that was measured for them, who wore wool that was issued to them, who moved through buildings and courtyards and storerooms that were, in every practical sense, their entire professional world. The records catch them in categories. A class of worker who received grain rations at a standard daily rate. A class who received slightly more. A class who received oil or textile allotments in addition. The categories have names in the tablets, though the names are institutional labels, not personal ones. The equivalent of job titles rather than the names a family would have used. What we can read is their function within the system. What we cannot read is anything else about them. This is one of those details that becomes more interesting the longer you sit with it. The institution was large enough to have layers of workers doing different things. It was organised enough to maintain consistent ration categories across time and across multiple tablets. It issued food in standardised amounts that varied by role, which means someone had decided what each role was worth in grain and oil and cloth. And that decision had become normal enough that no one needed to explain it each time. It was simply applied. The storerooms that held these goods were not incidental buildings. They were the functional core of the institution. Long rooms, from what excavation suggests, with thick walls and minimal openings, are the kind of architecture designed to keep temperature and moisture as stable as possible. Jars sealed with clay stoppers and marked with impressions from cylinder seals. Small carved stone cylinders that were rolled across wet clay to leave a patterned impression that identified origin, authorization, or both. The sealed jar was not just a container, it was a statement. It said, "This has been checked, this belongs to the institution, and this should not be opened without proper reason." The smell of a storeroom like that would have been particular. Dry grain has a dusty, slightly sweet smell that sits low in the air. Sealed jars of beer or fermented liquid add something slightly sour beneath that. Animal-related stores, dried meat, hides, wool in bundles, bring in something warmer and heavier. The combination is not unpleasant. Exactly, but it is dense. It is the smell of an institution that runs on physical things moving through physical space in carefully managed quantities. Meanwhile, outside those storerooms, the courtyards moved. Herders brought animals through. Carriers arrived with loads from outlying fields or smaller settlements. Scribes, or people performing the function that scribes would later perform more explicitly, sat near the movement and made records. Not of everything, not in the way a modern inventory system might track every unit, but of what mattered most, the quantities that were large enough to lose track of, the distributions that needed to be accounted for, the resources that crossed some threshold between informal and official. The people doing the counting were not the same as the people doing the carrying. The records suggest differentiation of function that goes well beyond a simple division between workers and supervisors. There were categories of specialised labour, people associated with particular crafts or roles within the institutional economy, and there were categories that appear to sit above them in terms of ration level or access. The tablets don't use a word for rank, but they enact one through the differences in what each category received. At some point in this layered structure, authority rested somewhere. The grain didn't measure itself. The jars didn't seal themselves. The ration amounts didn't set themselves. Someone, or some body of people, or some institutional role, held the capacity to organise all of this and to keep it running across seasons and across personnel changes. What that authority looked like from the outside is one of the genuinely open questions of this period. There is an image type that appears in the art and seal impressions of late 4th millennium Mesopotamia. a human figure that scholars often describe as the priest-king type. It's an interpretive label, not a title the figure wore. The figure appears in scenes of ritual, hunt and combat, and it tends to be depicted at a scale or in a position that implies elevated status within the visual grammar of the period. Whether this figure represents a specific role, a category of leadership, or a recurring iconographic convention used across different kinds of authority is still actively discussed among researchers. The image is real. The interpretation of what it meant in its original context remains open. What the image suggests, at minimum, is that late Uruk society had a visual vocabulary for depicting someone in a position of consequence. That vocabulary was standardized enough to appear across different objects and different contexts, and that figure, whoever or whatever it actually represented, was associated in the visual record with things like the management of animals, the oversight of labour, and the performance of activities that may have carried both civic and sacred significance. The truth is, the boundary between sacred function and civic administration in this period is not a clean one. The buildings that scholars interpret as temples were also, by the evidence of the tablets found within and near them, administrative centres. The institution that managed the grain also managed the animals and the labour and the distribution of goods. And whether that institution derived its authority from a religious claim, from the practical fact of controlling resources, from the prestige of a ruling lineage, or from some combination of all three, is not something the tablets settle. They are silent on the question of justification. They record outcomes, not reasoning. This is a slightly strange thing to sit with. A system that was clearly large, clearly organised, clearly capable of sustained coordination across many people and many goods, and yet one whose internal logic of authority we can only approach through the edges. The records tell us what the institution did. They don't tell us why anyone agreed to let it do those things. And yet, for the people who worked within it, that question was probably not a daily concern. The grain came, the ration was issued, the jar was sealed. The count was recorded. The next day came and the process repeated. The institution held because the institution had always held, or held long enough, that questioning it was not part of the ordinary rhythm of a working day. Over time, this structure continued. Seasons turned, storerooms filled and emptied, records accumulated in the archive rooms, stacked or sorted in ways that have not entirely survived. Workers were born into this world and died in it, their lives recorded only in the institutional categories they belonged to, never in the personal details that would have made them visible to us. What changes, slowly, over the following centuries, is not the basic structure of institutional life. Storerooms and rations and scribal records continue for a very long time. What shifts is something more surface level, but more legible. Names begin to appear. Not just role categories, but specific designations attached to specific people or specific positions. The record begins to acquire a face, or something closer to one. The long anonymous hum of institutional life starts to give way, slowly and unevenly, to the first traces of something that looks like remembered individuals. People with positions, with titles, with a kind of weight in the record that goes beyond a ration category. That shift doesn't happen cleanly or quickly, and the institutions that were already there don't disappear when it does. They remain, the storerooms remain, the rations remain, the scribes remain. What begins to grow alongside them is a new language of authority, one that would, in time, leave a different kind of mark on the clay. Names begin to appear. That's the shift, and it happens so slowly in the record that there is no clear moment to point to. No tablet that sits on one side of a line and another that sits on the other. It's more like watching a shoreline in low tide. You don't see the water retreating. You just notice after a while that the sand is wider than it was. The world of late Uruk the storerooms, the ration categories, the anonymous scribe pressing signs into clay without signing the work. Does not end. It continues. The institutions persist. The counting persists. What changes is that the record begins, very gradually, to carry something more personal. A title attached to a position. A designation that suggests not just a role, but a specific holder of that role. The weight of a particular seat, rather than just the function of it. And this transition from institutional anonymity to something approaching named authority is one of the most studied and least resolved questions in the archaeology of early Mesopotamia. Scholars can describe what the record looks like before and after. What they cannot cleanly describe is the process in between, how a world organised around institutional categories became one in which a single figure at the top of that structure was eventually identifiable, commemorated, and in some cases mythologized. The difficulty is partly one of material. Many of the archaic tablets, the earliest ones from what archaeologists designate as the Uruk 4 and Uruk 3 phases, were not found in their original positions. They were found in what excavators call secondary deposits, places where old material had been cleared and dumped as the city continued to build on top of itself. Tablets that belonged to one generation of record keeping ended up mixed with rubble from later construction. Their content survived. Their original context, in many cases, did not. This is one of the quieter frustrations of working with very ancient material. The object survives, but the relationship between the object and its surroundings has been disturbed. You have the record. You have lost the room it came from. For a while, scholars worked with script phases to navigate this, rather than dating tablets by where they sat in the excavation layers, which had been compromised by ancient reuse. They dated them by what the signs looked like. Earlier sign forms in one group, a later more standardised sign forms in another. This gave researchers a way to sequence the development of the writing system even when the physical stratigraphy was hard to read. It was a workable solution to a difficult problem, and it produced a broadly accepted framework, though the relationship between script phase and exact historical moment remains a careful conversation rather than a settled timeline. What the sequence does show, with reasonable clarity, is that the writing system developed and standardised over time. The earliest signs are more variable, slightly different hands, slightly different conventions, signs that had not yet settled into the forms that later writers would learn as fixed. As the phases progress, the signs become more consistent. The system tightens. More tablets appear. The administrative vocabulary expands. The institution, whatever its precise form, was growing in its capacity to record. Meanwhile, Uruk itself was not the only place this was happening. The Jemdet Nasr period, which follows the late Uruk phase and covers roughly the last centuries of the 4th millennium and the early centuries of the 3rd, shows a continuation and in some respects a broadening of the administrative tradition. Tablets from this period come from multiple sites. The sign system continues developing. There are changes in how certain commodities are recorded, expansions in the range of what the writing covers, shifts in institutional vocabulary that suggest the world the writing served was itself shifting. And yet the tablets from this phase are still, fundamentally, administrative. They are still recording quantities, categories, institutions. They are still speaking in the plural, as it were, in the language of the institution rather than the language of a person. The first-person voice, the named ruler declaring something, the royal inscription that says, "I did this," those come later, in what scholars organise as the early dynastic period, which follows the Jemdet Nasr phase and begins to give us the world of Mesopotamian city-states that is more familiar from later historical memory. That world is different in texture, not because the institutions disappear, but because a new layer has grown on top of them. The layer of named individuals who held authority, who commissioned buildings and monuments and texts that carried their names forward. At the layer of dynastic memory, the records that say not just what was counted, but who counted it, and who authorised the counting, and whose reign the counting happened during. The gap between these two worlds, the anonymous administrative world of late Uruk and the personally commemorated world of the early dynastic city-states, is real. Scholars can describe it. They can point to where the record changes character. What they cannot fully reconstruct is the story of how one became the other. The truth is, it may not have been a story at all, in the sense of a sequence of events that could be narrated. It was more likely a long accumulation. Roles that had been institutional, gradually attached to specific persons. Persons who held those roles long enough, or effectively enough, began to be remembered by name. The memory of those names created a precedent. The precedent hardened into expectation. The expectation became tradition. At some point, tradition became history. The kind of history that later Mesopotamian scribes themselves organised into king lists, recording the sequence of rulers city by city, reign by reign, stretching back to a time before the flood. Those king lists are remarkable objects in their own right, and they are also deeply complicated ones. They are not straightforward records, they are retrospective constructions, compiled long after the events they describe, organising the past into a coherent sequence that the past itself almost certainly did not experience as coherent. The reigns they assign to early rulers, stretching to tens of thousands of years in some cases, are not historical in the literal sense, but they are a different kind of statement. A claim about depth, about legitimacy, about the age and therefore the weight of a particular tradition. What people rarely noticed, standing before those later inscriptions, was how much had already happened before the names began. How many seasons of grain had been counted, how many jars had been sealed, how many workers had received their rations and gone back to work in the morning without anyone recording who they were. The deep foundation of name kingship was built on decades, and then centuries, of institutional life that operated without requiring a name at the top. The clay was already speaking long before it learned to say a ruler's name. It was speaking in numbers and categories, and sealed containers, and careful records of things that moved through courtyards in the early morning, before the heat settled in and the day's work slowed. That earlier voice is harder to hear. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't commission monuments or compose inscriptions. It just counts, and counts again and keeps the count somewhere dry enough to last. But it was there first, and in the most practical sense it made everything that came after possible. The cities, the dynasties, the inscriptions, the histories, all of it resting, without acknowledgement, on the quiet work of people who press marks into clay and never thought to sign their names. The city is gone now, in the way that mudbrick cities go. Not all at once, not in a single event, but gradually. Walls softening in rain, rooftops collapsing inward, rooms filling with the slow drift of sand and debris, until there was nothing left above the ground that anyone walking past would recognise as a city. The plain absorbed it. The flat land of southern Mesopotamia, patient as it always was, took back the walls it had lent. What remains is a tell. A low mound, rising modestly above the surrounding plain, the kind of feature that looks like a natural hill, until you understand that the earth beneath it is artificial. Layer upon layer of occupation, each generation building on the compressed remains of the one before. The site of ancient Uruk, known today by the Arabic name Warka, rises from the landscape in this way. Our archaeologists have worked it across more than a century of excavation, and the work continues in the intervals that politics and circumstance allow. The mound gives up its material slowly, the way ancient things tend to do. What the mound has given up includes the tablets, the mud brick architecture, the cone mosaics in fragments, the seal impressions, the outlines of large structures whose full extent is still being traced. These are the confirmed survivals. the physical objects that made it through the centuries of burial in good enough condition to be excavated, studied, conserved, and eventually understood within a broader framework of early urban life. But what did not make it through is worth sitting with first in the quiet way that loss tends to deserve. The voices did not survive, and not a single spoken sentence from the world of late Uruk has come down to us, because spoken language leaves no trace in clay unless someone chooses to write it down. And the people of this period were not yet writing language in that way. They were writing categories, not conversations, numbers, not sentences, the institution's record, not the person's thought. Whatever was said in the courtyards, in the storerooms, across the canal banks, between the person delivering the grain and the person receiving it, all of that is gone in a way that cannot be recovered. The intact archives are also mostly gone, in the sense that matters most. The tablets survive, but their original arrangement does not. The rooms they were stored in collapsed. In the ordering systems, if there were ordering systems beyond physical proximity and spatial habit, left no impression on the clay itself. Scholars can group tablets by script phase, by sign type, by content category, by site of discovery. What they cannot reconstruct is the experience of walking into an archive in the late 4th millennium and knowing by the arrangement of the room exactly where everything was and why. The social texture is gone too. The way authority was felt day to day by the people who worked within the institution. The sounds of the city at different hours. The particular routines that structured mornings differently from afternoons, working days differently from rest days. The ceremonies, if there were ceremonies, that marked the transition from one season's counting to the next. These things existed because all human communities developed them, but the record that reached us was never interested in documenting any of that. It was interested in quantities, and so the texture of daily life in the most organised settlement the ancient world had yet produced is, for the most part, silence. That silence is not tragic exactly. It is simply the condition of very old things. Most of what any generation produces in the way of daily life does not survive to the next, let alone to 5,000 years later. The remarkable thing is not what was lost. The remarkable thing is what was kept. And what was kept is more than it first appears. The clay tablets survived. Not all of them, and not in perfect condition, and not with their context intact. But they survived in numbers large enough to constitute a real record of an institutional world that was doing something genuinely new. They are in museums now, in London and Paris and Berlin and New York and Baghdad, and in university collections and research archives, and in storage drawers that have not yet been fully catalogued. Scholars spend careers reading them. The field of cuneiform studies is a small one, but it has been accumulating knowledge for over a century, and what it has produced is a picture, partial, cautious, responsible about its own gaps, of a world that organised itself before it had the language to describe itself. The sign system survived too, in the form of its development. Proto-cuneiform became cuneiform, and the early pictographic leaning impressions of the late 4th millennium evolved, over the following centuries, into the wedge-shaped script that Mesopotamian civilization would use for 3,000 years, pressed into clay for administrative records, legal codes, correspondence, hymns, laments, mathematical tables, astronomical observations, and eventually the literary compositions that have been read and studied in the modern world. All of that began with the accounting habit, the reed stylus to the clay surface, the mark for grain, the mark for a number. The rest grew from that. The urban idea survived. The notion that a large number of people could live and work in a shared settlement, organised by institutions served by specialised labour, supplied through coordinated distribution, that idea did not need to be reinvented. And it was inherited. Uruk's successors in the region, the cities of the early dynastic period, and the later empires that rose and fell across Mesopotamia were all building on a foundation that the late Uruk world had already laid. They did not think of themselves as inheriting anything from an anonymous administrative phase 5 centuries before their own time. But the canal systems, the grain storage methods, the scribal training, the basic logic of running a city through records, all of it carried forward in the deep structure of the civilization, whether or not anyone acknowledged where it came from. And the tablets themselves survived as a kind of patience. They waited in the ground, under collapsed walls, under centuries of accumulation, under the slow weight of a landscape that had moved on from the people who once lived there. But they waited without knowing they were waiting. Clay has no intention, it simply holds what was pressed into it, for as long as conditions allow. And in this case, conditions allowed for a very long time. What the tablets carry, in the end, is not a story. It is a pattern. The pattern of a world that needed to count and counted, and left the count behind in the only material it had available that was durable enough to last. Not stone, which required tools and skill and time. Not wood or reed or leather, which decay. Just clay, shaped by hand, pressed by a cut reed, set aside to dry in the air of a room that no longer exists. There is something in that pattern that runs through a very long stretch of human time. The need to make a mark that outlasts the moment. The need to say, this happened, this was here, and this was counted and measured and known. Not for posterity, not with any sense of the centuries that would follow, just for the practical reason that tomorrow someone would need to know, and the person who knew today could not guarantee they would still be there to tell them. Much of that first ordered world dissolved back into the plane it rose from. The walls went, the voices went, the arrangements went, but the marks remained, pressed into surfaces that had no idea they were recording anything more than the ordinary business of a working day. And that in the end may be the only kind of history that truly survives. Not the version that was meant to last, the version that simply did.